Okay, today I'm going to be talking to you about an upcoming paper that should be published sometime in the next couple of weeks. Hopefully it will load. Hold on a second. There we go. And so it's called Unsettling Marine Conservation, Disrupting Manifest Destiny-Based Conservation Practices Through the Operationalization of Indigenous Value Systems. Yes, that's a mouthful, totally a huge title there. My name is Lara Jacobs, Choho Muscogee. I'm a citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation, and I also have Choctaw heritage. I'm a PhD student at Oregon State University, and I'm a recreation ecologist, and I do a lot of work with traditional ecological knowledge in my studies and my publications. So a quick overview about the presentation. I'm going to give you just an introduction to the paper, and then I'm going to give you some roots so that you can understand the background of the topics that I'm going to be discussing. And then I'll talk to you about some of the methods that we used in the paper. And even though we used a lot of Indigenous value systems in this paper, I'm trying to keep it in context of the conference themes, which are relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility. So I'm just going to be talking about those three, and then I'll open things up to a community discussion at the end of the presentation. So the paper, I told you the long name of the paper. It will be published maybe next week or the week after in the Park Stewardship Forum. This is an open access journal, which means that anyone can view it. You don't have to pay to have access. We need more open access to information, by the way, just kind of a thing in academia. We don't need any more paywalls for information. It'll be published in the special issue of the Park Stewardship Forum on Indigenous Leadership and Marine Conservation. And this is really kind of an important thing because this is a journal for park and protected area managers, and it's a journal that is specifically written completely by Indigenous people. And it was even like the peer review process for this journal was conducted by Indigenous people. And we don't see that very much in academia. So this is super exciting. It was written by 4 Indigenous authors, including myself, Coral Avery, who's a citizen of Shawnee Nation, Rode and Catherine, who are both citizens of my tribe as well. And this is more of a critical thought piece where we sat down together and we thought about marine conservation and figured out some ways to think about it critically. So let's get into the historical roots and the historical context about marine conservation and value systems in general. So you've heard this from almost every single presenter at the summit today. And, you know, it's kind of sad that we have to tell people this history over and over and over. But Indigenous peoples have existed here since time immemorial for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. And we've been able to do that because we have been in good relations with all of our ecosystem elements, with our kins, with our plants, our animals, with the lands, and with the waters forever. And we carry forward Indigenous value systems. And sometimes these can be different from tribe to tribe, from community to community. But there is a lot of shared value systems, even though they may be defined a little bit differently, that we can look to when we're thinking about Indigenous values. And those have allowed us to be here for tens of thousands of years. And other things that have helped us during that time are the Indigenous sciences we hold. Indigenous peoples are the oldest scientists in this world. We have the oldest form of science, like traditional ecological knowledge. And Western academics and academia in general is just now coming to appreciate our knowledges, but these are a lot older than Western knowledges, and they're time tested. We also have cultural and spiritual practices that have informed our abilities to be sustainable in our landscapes and to have good relations and to live in good ways with all of our ecosystem elements through time. Unfortunately, about 500 years ago, or a little bit longer than that ago, we had a bunch of European settlers decide that they were going to come over here and colonize our lands. And I'm talking more in like a United States-based focus, by the way, for this presentation. They brought with them a bunch of different value systems that had not really been on these lands before. And they also brought over new forms of knowledge, their forms of Western science that are very distinct from the ways that Indigenous peoples tend to understand our natural environments. And I say natural italicized, if you can talk in italics, because natural is another Western conception of, these distinctions between humans and nature. And indigenous peoples, generally, we see ourselves as part of the systemic functioning body. We are nature just as much as the plants are and the animals are and the rest of our kin. European settlers also brought over the concept of manifest destiny. And if you don't know what manifest destiny is, it is this permission that was granted to European Judeo-Christian settlers from God, from their God, that sanctions everything that happened for colonization. It permitted the spatial motion and control and colonization and ownership of indigenous territories by non-indigenous peoples. And it was centered on the development and maintenance of civilization. And so anything that looked like it was uncivilized, like indigenous peoples, and the ways that we lived and navigated our world was considered as other. Settler value systems and manifest destiny ideologies have a lot of intersections together, and they kind of work under this premise of this need and desire to conquer and defeat surroundings. And those surroundings could be the local environments where we've seen, large mountains and forests that are just completely shaved down to the watershed level. And it could be the conquering and defeating of indigenous peoples to take over their lands, or like in this picture, the conquering and defeating of our kin and our life-sustaining foods like the buffalo. Some of these other ideologies are about, this whole idea that anything that is uncivilized can be associated with evil. And this goes back to like these religious underpinnings where people who were living sustainable, indigenous peoples, were looked at as, those are evil ways to live because of the ways that we'd been doing it, forever, as per how settler colonialists would view us, and the ways that our people were living at that time. So I know that Dr. Dan Wildcat today talked a little bit about utilitarianism and these extractive practices and stuff like that, but these are all tied up with the value systems that allowed manifest destiny to happen, where we start commodifying the ways that we think about the natural world or just the world around us. And this goes back to these settler value systems where we have an extraction of what they refer to as natural resources, whereas indigenous peoples looked at that as, these are our functioning relationships. These are our trees, these are our plants, these are our animals, these are our lands, and these are our waters. And, we're in good relations living within them. And, they're not separate from us in the ways that European settlers thought that they were. And so all of these things have kind of set forth the trajectory of where we're at today, where we have capitalism, which is, it's a whole nother subject that is very problematic for indigenous peoples and really for anyone who's living under a capitalistic framework who doesn't have power and control. So each of these factors here have informed settler colonial land and water relations during the whole colonization periods of this country. And when we talk about colonization, I'm not talking about just this one point in time. Colonization is a systemic framework that is still influencing indigenous peoples today. And so we've seen a lot of those impacts from settler colonialism on indigenous peoples through the dispossessions of our lands, through the slavery of Black and indigenous peoples, through the establishment of these genocidal boarding schools. There's news out today where we're still trying to get counts to understand how many of our peoples and our ancestors died at these schools. We still don't know, but there's progress being made so we can figure that out years and years later. These boarding schools had assimilation policies to kill the Indian to save the man, and that meant stripping our indigenous ancestors, our family members, of our cultures, of our languages, of our practices, and assimilating them to these Judeo-Christian European traditions. And, these all are wrapped into United States policies that led up to the largest genocide in global history. And if you were here yesterday during our land acknowledgement workshop, I talked about this. I'm going to talk about it again. When we think about genocide and how genocide has happened in the world, we used to have 60 million indigenous peoples in North America before Columbus came. And a century later, those numbers were diminished to 6 million people. We lost 90% of our populations during the beginning of colonialism. So the purpose of our paper, and I'm sure everyone's going, what does this have to do with marine conservation? But there's a lot of this that's tied up into it. And our paper is intended to help unsettle the ways that manifest destiny is operationalized by marine conservation, and to dismantle the problematic value systems connected to manifest destiny and marine conservation. We're hoping that this will create different types of shifts in the ways that marine conservation values are centered in, or like manifest destiny based values are centered in marine conservation frameworks, and help us to start recentering Indigenous centered frameworks instead. And in doing so, this could help us create more equitable conservation practices and center the sustainable stewardship of marine areas that Indigenous peoples have been doing forever. So if we think about marine conservation, this might be very distinct from the ways you've ever thought about marine conservation before. It might be kind of a hot topic, but we've been really critically looking at marine conservation and what it is and what it does. And we have defined this as a construction of settler colonialism. And the only reason we have marine conservation today is because of the values that have been embedded within and enacted by manifest destiny, like the control of Indigenous peoples' lands and water, the colonizations of our areas, the ownership of our lands and our marine systems, and this need to maintain a sense of civilization that, you know, is defined by European Judeo-Christian standards even still today. And again, there's this idea of the utility and extraction of natural resources. And all of these things, including capitalism, have created all of the environmental problems that we see today that make it so that marine conservation is necessary. So we see this as a product of settler colonialism. If you have ever heard of a very famous piece of literature called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by TEK and Yang, they have a whole section of that paper that talks about settler moves to innocence. And we've reflected a lot on their words. And we see marine conservation as another settler move to innocence, because we have a situation where there are a lot of environmentally conscious settlers who are relieving their guilt over the destruction of Indigenous lands and waters. So they see the products of colonialism and they feel guilty about it and they want to do better. And so they start doing habitat restoration and species conservation. But there's not a whole lot of sense of relations and kin in those practices. And these are settler moves to innocence because they never rectify the historical and current harms that have caused those problems. And what does that boil down to? It boils down to land and water dispossessions. It boils down to our removals as Indigenous peoples from our ancestral territories, the loss of our stewardship and our rights to manage and, you know, facilitate our traditional ecological knowledge and stewardship of lands and water areas. And marine conservation still works under these Western paradigms where we have Western defined geographic boundaries and management paradigms that just continuously erase Indigenous peoples. So to us, we look at marine conservation as a settler move to innocence. And it also actualizes the values of manifest destiny and settler colonialism, because it perpetuates settler violences against Indigenous peoples and marine systems. You might ask yourself for, you know, a second, how does marine conservation create violences to Indigenous peoples? I will be talking about that very shortly. But it also actualizes manifest destiny because our lands are still colonized, and it continues the colonization of our lands and our waters through different things like the creation of marine protected areas. Marine conservation also still adheres to capitalistic notions that favor individualism over the common good, and even favors species over other species, as Dr. Jennifer Grenz talked about yesterday. And it has a lot of white supremacy embedded within it. And, you know, all of these factors are legitimized by European and Judeo-Christian settler constructions of the natural world, where they don't see themselves as mainstay species of ecosystems. And instead, they situate themselves outside of them. And they say, I'm going out to nature instead of thinking of themselves as part of nature, of part of the world around them, as part of those lands and part of those waters. So all of these things uphold the notion that settlers have access to indigenous lands as well, which is also, problematic, but that goes back to manifest destiny. So how can these things be violent to indigenous peoples? Marine conservation is pretty rife on a global scale with these types of conservation practices called fortress and green militarized conservation. And both of these practices embody manifest destiny value systems because they enact harmful and control-oriented conservation objectives. They prioritize species, based on their own biases. And they orient control over marine systems with colonial institutions. So when marine parks or marine protected areas are established, who's managing those? It's usually colonial entities. And we often see the maintenance of human and animal dichotomies where we are still dividing humans as like this on a hierarchy with animals where we are not an animal, but we are like at the top of the food chain thing. Fortress and green militarized conservation also uphold and center European and Western scientific ideologies and objectives. And we are just now getting to a point in time where they're going, oh yeah, indigenous peoples, they know some things about these environments. Maybe we should talk to them. But for the majority of history, marine conservation has not included our knowledges. The value systems of marine conservation are problematic as well, because we have these ideas of wilderness and nature and what is considered as natural. And, those are problematic because when we think of a wilderness and how it has been conceptualized by the Wilderness Act, it strips indigenous peoples and our histories with our lands away. And it creates this really problematic idea of how landscapes can exist without human impact or without human interactions. And that's something that has never happened before the establishment of the United States and before the Wilderness Act, especially during colonization or, before colonization. And so other value systems within marine conservation are the fact that the restoration efforts and objectives are still guided by these natural states of existences where we think things need to be perfect and that humans cannot have relations that are unharmful with lands and waters. And this kind of sets up this system where colonial governments get to permit who has access rights, who gets to authorize specific areas, who gets to actually participate in fishing and things like that. And it maintains cultural normativity. And the cultural normativity that we're talking about here is, again, European Judeo-Christian cultural values that are far preferenced by colonial governing systems here in, I guess, what we call North America today, or Turtle Island. Those are far preferred more than indigenous standards. And marine conservation is filled with biases, when you think about what is deemed worthy of protection. So fortress conservation has a lot of guiding philosophies. I'm going to try to go quickly through this, but they are that local populations are irrational, especially indigenous peoples, and they are destructive to local ecosystems. And these are the drivers of our losses of biodiversity and environmental degradation. So they focus on local people, mainly indigenous peoples, as the creators of these impacts. And in fortress conservation, they believe that the best way to achieve biodiversity is through the creation of protected areas that exist in isolation from human disturbance. Again, I'm going to say that these lands have always been indigenous and they've always had our influence. It's only settler colonialism and manifest destiny that have been able to drive this logic that we disturb environments, and the disturbances that we see today that have the need for conservation efforts are all because of the value systems that have happened historically, the shifts in those value systems. So fortress conservation also situates humans as external to nature instead of as part of nature. And as the driving reasons that we need defense mechanisms and even violence to be embedded within conservation practices. It also excludes human activities in local communities from areas because it puts up boundaries and closes off areas to practices, cultural practices, subsistence harvesting, and things like that. And it prioritizes local ecosystems at the expense of local and indigenous peoples' human rights. Green militarized conservation philosophies are even worse. This is when we actually start seeing the incorporation of military practices and values into conservation efforts. Again, we're deprioritizing human rights issues with this. And we are empowering colonial states to not just occupy indigenous lands, but to enforce those through militarized efforts. And these are increasing on a global scale under the guise of a war for biodiversity. When you start hearing that term, take a moment and pause, because this is what it looks like. It looks like people with guns, and it looks like people who have guns enforcing indigenous people's inability to access their lands. But these are used to justify, or the term war for biodiversity is used to justify repressive and coercive management policies that we're seeing on a global scale. And it's leading to the creation of new marine areas that are blending biodiversity objectives into geopolitical objectives from the settler states around the world to maintain security and resource extraction possibilities. So I always pause when I hear about new protected areas being created, and I think about what are they trying to do, and what is this going to do to local peoples and indigenous peoples. So the methods that we've used in this paper, we use a ton of them. I'm just going to really quickly go over these. We use two-eyed seeing, which is where we kind of bridge our indigenous sciences and knowledges with Western science. We used critical reflexivity to challenge and reveal inequalities from indigenous perspectives and how Western value systems don't create room for our perspectives generally, and especially marine conservation. And we used reflexivity to help dismantle power and privilege and the centrality of whiteness in marine conservation. We also used decolonization theory, symbology, and storytelling. And we did this to shift marine conservation value systems into frameworks that support indigenous people's rights. So this is a very important part of our paper. We sat there and thought about our indigenous value systems and how those are connected deeply to things like our origin stories and to, even into our symbology and things like that. But it is not our places to deliver sacred information to academic literature. And so we tried to figure out a very interesting way to convey how storytelling and, origin stories could help people understand how we have these indigenous value systems and where they are rooted from without turning over our sacred data. And so this might be controversial, but we decided to create non-traditional origin stories that are not true. These are not located to any indigenous people. We were very clear about that in our paper, but they're only used as an example for non-indigenous peoples to understand how they can relate to other indigenous value systems. And we did the same thing for our symbology. So we also took to task the 7 R's, and the 7 R's have been really defined as these indigenous value systems that are shared over multiple indigenous communities. And like I said before, these differ a little bit between indigenous communities. They can be defined differently, but for the most part, they are rights, respect, responsibility, relationships, reciprocity, relevance, and then we merge two here at the end, reconciliation through redistribution as well. So our paper tackles all of these factors, but in this presentation, we're only going to be talking about responsibility, relationships, and reciprocity. Okay, so the 7 R's. When I talk about symbology, if you look at this image, we also did a massive amount of loom beading for this paper, and these are our symbols that we created, our non-traditional symbols. And what we've done here is we had multiple beaters, and so loom beading, technically you usually only do it with one loom, but we had 3 different looms, so you're going to see how we had to sew these together. That was a task. I think there's like 36,000 beads on this beaded project. But what you're seeing here is how we have conceptualized the 7 R's through non-traditional symbology. And each of these symbols has its own story that connects back to the non-traditional origin story that we created for this paper. And we put them all together because with Indigenous value systems, there's no real hierarchical ordering. There's not like one that's of the greatest importance. They all reinforce and weave together the way that we do our practices and our principles and our connections between all factors of the environment and how we're able to facilitate our cultures and maintain our traditions through time. And so beading in and of itself is an act of weaving together these stories. And so that's why we chose to create these symbols through beadwork. I'm not going to get into the stories today. You're going to have to check my paper out to read that, but you can check out the symbols. So responsibility, we defined this. And when I say we, just the authors of this paper, these value systems will look different to different Indigenous communities. We also do not speak for our tribes. I will say that as well. None of us are speakers for our tribes. So with responsibility, we defined it as the communal obligation to care and protect our relatives, including our Indigenous kin, such as plants and animals, and even the lands and the waters. Responsibility can also be defined as, or it's embedded within Indigenous peoples' origin stories, which helps define some Indigenous communities' roles and responsibilities with other living systems and the responsibilities to specific elements within those ecosystems. Responsibility to us is a system that is deeply rooted in the caretaking practices of Indigenous peoples who have for tens of thousands of years taken care of all life systems. And those life systems have also taken care of us, by the way, because we have honored the relational aspects of how to live in a good way within all of our ecosystem elements. It's important to note that not all relational obligations are the same, though. And, they're going to differ between tribe, between Indigenous communities, between even sometimes clans and things like that. So those relational obligations and considerations may differ pretty distinctly. So when we think about conservation issues that deal with responsibility, we've seen in the Pacific and climate change discourse that scientists are believing, and they've started a lot of discourse here, where they're saying that it's really unlikely that the Pacific Islands are going to be inhabited by Indigenous peoples because of climate change. So they're starting this narrative where Indigenous people should think about relocating. But why is this? What is climate change? Climate change is linked very directly to settler colonialism and manifest destiny and capitalism and all of those other value systems that I talked about earlier. We see climate change as a fortress operation of the colonial state that realizes manifest destiny. It helps to make sure that we continue to remove Indigenous peoples from our lands, but we have Indigenous peoples who are enacting their responsibilities to their lands and their waters by resisting this discourse that is centered on the inevitability of their relocations. In 2014, the Pacific Climate Warriors blocked Australia's largest shipping port for coal. And if you don't know anything about what they did, they're awesome. Go read about it. They're amazing. They challenged the extractive practices of Pacific Rim countries. So not just one country, but a lot of countries. And they demanded that fossil fuel companies and countries that have high emittance of greenhouse gases be held responsible and accountable for the harms of their actions. And so what were they doing? They were enacting their cultural responsibilities, their connections with their lands and the marine waters. And they were enacting intergenerational pathways of connecting to waterly bodies. When we think about bodies, we have bodies of land, we have our bodies, we have bodies that we are in relation with to other animals and things like that. But water is also a body that we, all Indigenous peoples, hold dear to us. Water is life. They also enacted their cultural responsibilities of resistance to resist narratives about their inevitable relocations. And so how do we operationalize responsibility when we're thinking about marine conservation? The first thing we have to do is view water and land as life and not as these extractive, utility-based commodities. The second thing that we have to do is we have to activate our Indigenous responsibilities to take care of Earth's body, and that includes our waterly bodies. And we think that if marine protected areas started to consider managing things like this with the collaboration of Indigenous peoples, or the co-equal management of those lands and waters with Indigenous peoples, that it would help us generate better connections and resistance frameworks that can be used in marine conservation efforts. And so we also suggest that we need to see more people, especially Indigenous peoples and allies. Where are our allies in this conversation? We need to see them asserting decolonial pressures via activism that challenge settler colonial violence, and that challenge these manifest destiny value systems that are pervading marine conservation today. And in doing so, we can all start to construct new decolonial futures for the earth and its waters, and for everything, that all the life that is encompassed within those. I mean, all of the life in the water, all of the life on the earth, all of our relatives, all the plants, all the animals, all of the above. So when we're thinking about operationalizing responsibility, marine managers can operationalize these functions, these things I was just talking about, by providing pathways for Indigenous peoples to actualize their responsibilities in our ancestral homelands. What does that look like? That looks like starting with co-equal management approaches, where we have federal governing systems uplift Indigenous sovereign nations into co-equal or co-equity based management frameworks, where we are managing these together. And then that is our path to land back, where we can actually start at some point building the capacity to being the stewards of these lands again, and to do that solely and autonomously without colonial governance interference. And I honestly believe that we need to start a new conversation about water back, because it's not just land back. We need our water back as well, especially our marine waters that are starting to get convoluted into this 30 by 30 plan, where we're going to have lots and lots of more marine protected areas starting to limit our rights and access to our waters. So relationships, this is our second Indigenous value system. With relationships, we have connections between kinship systems and the interrelationships of all lifeways, including, the ways that we are relational to other beings. They also have intergenerational accountability frameworks that incorporate our past, our current lived realities, and our future. So 3 temporal elements. And they recognize our relations to all of creation, to all life forms, and our ability to follow implicit instructions that have been handed down to us by our origin stories, by our creation stories, by our spiritual practices and our cosmologies, and our ontologies, or just our basic understandings of the surrounding world. Relationships are also guiding methodologies that we can use between peoples, between lands, between waters and other lifeways, to understand our place in the world today. So there are some problems, though, with fortress conservation relationships, because it erases the essential relations that Indigenous peoples have as mainstay species and of lands and waters. And fortress conservation and marine conservation in general have created a chain reaction of issues that never existed before colonial contact. If we look at this this image on this page, you can think of pre-colonialism as the healthy parts of this image. And then when we look at the other part, here's a really good depiction of colonialism. This is what it has done, not just to Indigenous peoples, but to our more than human relatives as well. And this is because of things like overfishing and pollution and climate change and harmful toxins that have been put into our waters, and they've just damaged them. Winona LaDuke has an amazing book called To Be a Water Protector. If you haven't read that, go read it. It's inspiring. She talks a lot about intergenerational accountability, which is a mainstay of Indigenous relationships to the past and to the future. And then she talks about this idea of what she terms as historical amnesia, where settlers forget their deep ties to lands and waters and their ancestral homelands. We all have ancestral roots somewhere, but because of settler colonialism and because of manifest destiny, people just don't know where they were connected to, or where those ancestral roots exist. And she says that this leads to ecological amnesia, where people forget what once existed and they sever their relationships that they should be having with ecosystems. And both of these things are convoluted by her idea of transience, where people don't really fully understand or connect to or love a place or ecosystem. And subsequently, they transition or over to just actively seeking for greener pastures. And they're moving from one landscape to the next without forming those deep roots that guide, indigenous people's relationships with the land. Settlers don't have those because of those issues. So in transience, we see this as being operationalized by fortress and green militarized conservation practices, because they force local people to seek other ecosystems or relations, because we have the generation or the genesis of marine protected areas. And once they boot local and indigenous peoples out, they have to move on and try to find another ecosystem to connect with. And this is what we think is actually causing environmental impacts, because people are losing sight of the need or of their needs to have relationships with lands and waters. And she calls this ecological amnesia, like I just mentioned. When you bring that into the same conversation as transience, it diminishes human relationships with lands and waters, and it minimizes the numbers of humans who are protecting these elements, which is why we have indigenous water protectors and land protectors, because we haven't lost those roots as indigenous peoples. So with relationships, it always focuses on, conservation, marine conservation and other types of conservation always focus on what's happening right now and what's happening in the future. They don't ever address the historic issues that have led to the current problems, and they don't intersect historical issues and future planning to indigenous people's rights. So this goes back to those settler moves of innocence. They also don't consider relational aspects in their planning and concentric ecologies, as Dr. Daniel Wildcat was just saying in his keynote this morning. So here's a map of the marine protected areas that were there in, I just lost my thing, in 2017, all around the globe. And by 2030, they're trying to increase these by 30%. So 30% of the world's ocean should be deemed as, in protected areas by 2030, I believe is the goal. And so in the United States, marine protected areas, they seem pretty good, right? At least on the surface. They offer protections for fish and animals and plant populations while minimizing or disallowing extractive activities. If you just read that about those, you're probably like, these are amazing, because it sounds great, sounds amazing. That's also greenwashing, because they're only considering current and future settler-based objectives. They're not usually considering indigenous people's objectives unless indigenous peoples are being part of those discussions and those planning processes. And typically, at least historically, we've seen no accounting for indigenous people's relations with lands and waters and other ecosystems that are part of these discussions. And the way that the United States has it currently set up is that only federal recognized tribes, so we're erasing a lot of other indigenous peoples, can be part of some of these stakeholder processes in defining rights and things like that to future marine protected areas. So marine protected areas restrict access and maintain colonial power dynamics through the creation of marine, of the protected areas. And they sever how indigenous peoples can protect and maintain relationships with waters and lands and animals and plants within these so-called sanctuaries, because they are creating this fortress where people are allowed to do certain things and other peoples are not allowed to. And I know I'm getting really far behind time, so I'll try to hurry up here. So when we're operationalizing relationships, we think that managers need to reflect on how the practices are rooted in manifest destiny and capitalism, and how they negatively influence the possibilities of people having beneficial relationships, especially between humans and waters and lands and things like that. So we need to shift conservation practices to educational objectives that bring humans into better relations with marine environments. And this is key, because when we start focusing on educating people about that root structure and the relational structure of why they need to be deeply connected to ecosystems, we can start to shift management paradigms so that people are honoring relations in a better way, in a good way. This requires managerial paradigm shifts where Indigenous peoples' sovereignty is granted as the supreme authority, though, especially over marine conservation practices. And it will disallow the need for fortress and green militarized conservation practices to need to happen. I'm going to quickly fly through reciprocity here. Reciprocity, we define this as the cyclical and mutual benefits from one life form to another. And that can be cyclical with our seasons or within life cycles and things like that. But they integrate Indigenous understandings of just a multitude of factors. And most of these are relational in how we understand our places in the world. But reciprocity can also look like the sharing and blending of knowledges as well. And so reciprocity and other Indigenous value systems can disrupt the harms of manifest destiny and colonialism because they are seated in communal obligations. And unlike anything that we see in marine conservation and, anything from colonial states, our communal obligations are seated in care and love and respect for all lifeways. And they were successful for tens of thousands of years before everyone else came over here and brought their ideas of civilization with them. So in reciprocity, a marine issue can be salmon. Salmon is very important to many different Indigenous cultures, and even MPA managers see them as important species. So they're often seen by kin and relatives as for many Indigenous peoples and part of their origin stories. We talk about this more in depth in our paper. But with fortress conservation practices, it actually disallows reciprocity-based relations to happen with people in marine protected areas. And but if we start to operationalize reciprocity and we allow that operationalization to happen by Indigenous peoples, we can see more holistic and regenerative relationships between species. And so we recommend that marine protected area managers should reflect on Indigenous value systems of reciprocity, but they need to do that with Indigenous people's leadership. And they need to consider what types of policies and practices are severing reciprocal relations between Indigenous peoples and their ancestral territories. And we also believe, and this was a question that was just asked in the last presentation about overpopulation. We honestly believe that flourishing populations of people and marine animals are still possible today. We used to have 60 million Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. 60 million, that's a lot of people. We were here and living in good relations. That's the difference. The difference isn't the numbers, the difference is the relations. And to be able to live in that capacity today, we're going to need significant changes in how things are managed. We're going to need to integrate our Indigenous value systems and Indigenous knowledges into how all lands and waters are managed in the future. And to do this, we have to unsettle manifest destiny value systems in marine protected areas. This requires Indigenous leadership. It requires us to blend knowledges, to let our Indigenous knowledges lead, and to incorporate Western science wherever we need to understand other things as well. But it requires us to recognize how white supremacy and manifest destiny and other legacies of colonialism maintain systems of harm and inequities. But if we take this new blended approach, we can start regenerating kinship systems and reciprocal bonds that can be used as tools so that we can overcome modern and future challenges as well. But this has to be approached through respect for the equal benefit of all parties. So, okay, I'm going to close out because I know I'm over time. Sorry for going over time, but if you want to read more, there's a lot more in that paper. That's a huge paper too, so it was hard to pack into this time slot, but we can move to Q&As.
Thank you so much. We only have one question, so I don't know if there's any more of the presentation you want to cover after that. But Christian made kind of a comment that says, thank you so much for this amazing presentation, Lara, and for being so courageous and thought-provoking. Not so much for today, but at some time in the future, Christian would love to hear your thoughts on Indigenous protected and conserved areas, such as, so maybe another.
and that's something I didn't get to in the presentation today, but there are a lot of Indigenous communities around the world that literally have their own protected areas that they're managing, and they have these community-based systems. It's in our paper. I didn't have enough time to add it to my presentation, but Indigenous peoples are doing things the right way. So we have a lot of examples around the world that we should look to for information.
Awesome. Some more questions. Dave wants to know if there's a link to the paper. And also, what is your perspective on the national marine sanctuaries proposed by the Chumash and Pribilof communities?
Okay, hold on, I gotta find it. So is there a link to the paper? There is a link to the paper, but it's not published yet. So it'll be published in a week or two. If you would like a link to it, I'm gonna type my email in the chat, and anyone can email me and I will send it out. It's open access, so I'll just send you a link whenever it is ready. My email is really easy. It's my name. It's lara.jacobs@oregonstate.edu. So just email me and say, hey, let me know whenever that paper comes out, and I will send you that paper. What was the other part of the question? Sorry.
What is your perspective on the national marine sanctuaries proposed by the Chumash and Pribilof communities?
I'm trying to look for that one in the chat. I don't know. I haven't read about those yet. So I can't give an informed answer on that, but now I'm going to go and look into it. So thank you, Dawn. Thank you for that question. I'm going to take some notes.
Okay, we have another question from Callum. How might Indigenous values be integrated into settler environmental planning, such as conservation of state parks and public lands, in a way that is more than hearing them out?
Indigenous leadership, give us our lands back, create co-equity based management practices where we can manage with you, help us build our capacity back to oversee large areas of land, and give us back our lands. Non-Indigenous people do not need to be using our knowledges without us. That is something that we should guide the process of, that only we know how to implement those. We can't, it's hard to teach those things because they're so based in every fabric of who we are, from our cosmologies to our stories, to our sacred information, to our practices, to our ceremonies, and everything in between. So in a parks and protected area context, we need Indigenous leadership of these lands. We need Indigenous management of our lands and our waters. And the best way to start that is to start building co-equal based management systems. There's a very good example of this up in Washington with, oh my goodness, is it the Snohomish tribe? It's the Swinomish tribe, who is co-managing with Washington State Parks an area. So, I mean, this is how we get there. We probably need to build capacity because not all tribes are ready to do this. Some tribes may be, but if we can work together to take care of these lands first, then we can work on a way for us to get our lands back so that we can so that we can kind of restore some of the harms of the 500 years of colonization that we've had to deal with over time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have time for another question. Leah says, thank you so much for sharing your work. My question is, while we work toward land back, what immediate actions and behaviors do you want to see from allied settler ecologists, especially early career scientists with limited hierarchical power?
Okay, that's a good question. Power, it's all about power and control, right? Look to your Indigenous scientific peers, cite our work, lift our voices up, let us tell our stories, let us talk about our sciences, let us talk about our recommendations, cite us as much as you can, and create more of a demand in your universities for Indigenous academics. We make up less than 0.5% of all academics across institutions in this country. Everyone wants our knowledge, but they don't want us to be the ones teaching about them. So create demand for this. Make sure your institutions understand that, we have important things to say as well. And then find ways to value them. Have people come in and do guest lectures in your classrooms, if you have classrooms that you're managing, where they can talk about the work that they're doing, the work that needs to be done. Invest in Indigenous students if you're thinking about graduate students, and invest in Indigenous people's leadership. go and join our movements, go join these water protectors, and, you know, don't just like, don't go out there and take a picture and put it on social media, right? That's just performative. Go out there and join our protests, donate to our causes, vote for politicians who are going to uphold the Articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think those are the steps we can do. We need allies to be non-performative. We need you to actually start lifting us up and supporting what we're doing. And that can be financially, that can be through our movements, that can be through citations and just elevating our voices. A million different things you can do.
Awesome. And one final question. This is from Christy, who asks, are there examples of co-equal management or governance frameworks that you or within your paper would suggest that highlight as models to consider?
Yep, there's a lot. Read my paper. And I don't have a link to it yet. It'll be published in like a week or two. So send me an email and then I will send out the link to it once it's published to anyone who emails me. There's a lot, and there's some exciting things going around the world. Read my paper. I think we have a table in the paper that actually, no, it's a good paragraph that describes exactly where it's going on and how many Indigenous peoples and local communities have actually taken charge of their marine systems, and they're facilitating their own conservation efforts, and it's beautiful. And I mean, these are the beginning steps to land and water back that we need. And another thing I want to ask everyone, let's start talking about water back, please. It's more than just land. We need our waters back too. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you everyone for attending today. At 3 o'clock, we're having a panel, so we're going to take a small break right now. And thank you for this amazing presentation, Laura. I know I learned a lot. I enjoyed it a lot. So
thank you.
Take care. We'll see you back at 3.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you.